Steam rose from the wok as I tossed the noodles with practiced precision, the familiar rhythm of metal against metal mixing with the bustling sounds of my kitchen. The Golden Dragon had been my family's restaurant for 3 generations, and its heartbeat was as familiar to me as my home. Daniel, my father-in-law's voice cut through the kitchen noise like a dull knife. I hope you're finally ready to discuss a reasonable offer for this establishment. Richard Maxwell stood in my kitchen doorway, his expensive suit looking out of place among the well-worn equipment and aromatic steam. Behind him, his latest real estate development partner shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering why a prominent developer was wasting time in a small Chinese restaurant in what they called a transitional neighborhood. "Good evening, Richard," I replied, not taking my eyes off the wok. "The usual order? Your wife loves our Kung Pao chicken." "This isn't about dinner," he snapped. "Look around you, Daniel. This neighborhood is dying. These old buildings, these family businesses, they're relics. The future is luxury developments, high-end retail. Be smart for once in your life." I carefully plated the noodles, adding a perfect spiral of sauce before handing it to my head server, Ming. "The neighborhood isn't dying, Richard. It's evolving." "Is that what you call it?" He gestured around the kitchen. "This equipment is older than you are. The building needs repairs. Even with Sarah's trust fund supplementing your income, you can barely keep up." Ah, there it was. The trust fund comment. Richard never missed an opportunity to remind me that his daughter's money was the only thing keeping my failing business afloat. What he didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Sarah's trust fund remained untouched. Every repair, every upgrade, every property purchase had come from my own careful planning. "I appreciate your concern," I said, starting another order. "But the Golden Dragon isn't for sale." His development partner stepped forward. "Mr. Chen, perhaps if we discussed numbers." Maxwell Development is prepared to make a very generous offer. I studied the man, expensive watch, custom suit, eager smile. Another real estate speculator who saw our neighborhood as nothing but potential profit margins. "The Golden Dragon has been here for 60 years, I replied. "My grandfather started with nothing but a wok and a dream. Built this place into the heart of the community. Some things are worth more than money." Richard's face darkened. "This isn't about your family legacy, Daniel. This is about progress. Our new development will transform this entire block. Luxury hotels, upscale shopping, premium condos. Do you really want to be the only holdout? The only thing standing between this neighborhood and a real future?" I thought about the thick folder in my office upstairs, about the carefully organized property deeds and shell company documents, about the 5 years of quiet purchases and patient waiting. "How is the development coming along?" I asked mildly. I heard there were some issues with property acquisition. Richard waved dismissively. "Minor setbacks. Once people see the project's potential, they'll be lining up to sell." "If you say so." I turned back to my wok. "Now, unless you're staying for dinner, I have orders to prepare." After they left, Sarah emerged from the office upstairs. She'd heard everything. "Still not going to tell him?" she asked, wrapping her arms around my waist. I kissed her forehead. "Not yet. The timing isn't right." She laughed. "You and your timing. Sometimes I think you missed your calling as a chess player." "Chess is too rigid," I replied. "Real estate is more like cooking. It's about feeling the moment, knowing when to turn off the heat." And the heat was definitely rising. Richard's luxury development project was racing against time. They had investors expecting construction to begin in 3 months, permits ready to file. But they were missing one crucial ingredient. They didn't actually own enough property to build what they promised. What Richard didn't know was that his minor setbacks in property acquisition weren't random. Over the past 5 years, I've been quietly buying buildings throughout the neighborhood through various shell companies. Not just any buildings, strategic properties that would be essential for any major development project. The idea had started shortly after I took over the Golden Dragon from my father. I'd noticed developers starting to circle our neighborhood, buying up properties at low prices from aging owners. I saw the pattern forming, the same one that had destroyed other historic neighborhoods in our city. So I adapted. Used the restaurant's steady profits to secure small business loans. Created legitimate shell companies to hide my purchases from speculating developers. Slowly, carefully, I acquired key properties across the neighborhood. The Golden Dragon wasn't just a restaurant. It was my watchtower, giving me a perfect view of every real estate move in the area. I knew which properties were vulnerable, which owners were considering selling. More importantly, I knew exactly what Richard's development project needed to succeed. Later that night, after closing, I sat in my office reviewing recent property transfers. Ming knocked on the door. "Mr. Chen, there's someone here to see you." Mrs. Liu, owner of the corner grocery store, stepped into my office. She was in her 70s, had run her store for almost 40 years. "Daniel," she said in Mandarin, "they came to see me today. The developers offered me 3 times what the store is worth." I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Let me guess. Maxwell Development?" "Yes. They say I must sell quickly. Say everyone else is selling." She wrung her hands. "My children want me to take the offer. Say it's too much money to refuse." "Mrs. Liu," I said gently, "do you want to sell?" Tears filled her eyes. This store was my American dream. My husband and I came with nothing, built this life one day at a time. But maybe they are right. Maybe it's time to let go. I opened my desk drawer and removed a file. What if there was another option? She looked at me curiously as I explained my plan. By the time she left an hour later, she was smiling again. Another piece had fallen into place. The next morning, Richard's development team received some unexpected news. Mrs. Liu's grocery store had been sold, but not to them. The buyer was a small holding company they'd never heard of. In his downtown office, Richard Maxwell was about to learn that his minor setbacks were actually part of a much larger pattern. One that had been forming for 5 years, as quietly and steadily as steam rising from a well-tended wok. The heat was about to get turned up. The Maxwell Development Crisis meeting was in full swing when Sarah texted me their location. "Dad's face is getting redder by the minute," she wrote. "Board wants to know why they can't secure the properties they need." I smiled, turning back to my lunch prep. The timing was perfect, like knowing exactly when to add each ingredient to a complex dish. Over the past week, Richard's team had discovered that key properties they needed for their luxury development were owned by a web of seemingly unrelated companies: Summit Holdings LC, Eastern Star Investments, River City Properties, and half a dozen others. All had politely but firmly declined to sell. What they hadn't figured out yet was that every company traced back to me. "Daniel." Richard burst into my kitchen, this time with a full entourage: lawyers, development partners, and a very stressed-looking project manager. "What do you know about these property companies?" I carefully sliced green onions, each cut precise and even. "Good afternoon, Richard. Quite a crowd for lunch. Should I set up the private dining room?" "Stop playing games," he snapped. "Sarah says you know everything that happens in this neighborhood. These companies that keep blocking our development, what do you know about them?" I set down my knife and wiped my hands. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation upstairs." "Ming, take over the lunch prep." In my office, Richard paced while his team spread documents across my desk. The project manager, Adam Torres, pointed to a map of the neighborhood. "We've secured about 60% of the properties we need," he explained. "But these key parcels, the corner lots, the larger buildings, they're all owned by different investment companies. Without them, the project isn't viable." "Fascinating," I said, sitting behind my desk. "And this affects my restaurant how?" Richard slammed his hands on the desk. "Because you're going to help us contact these owners. You know everyone in this neighborhood. You must know who's behind these companies." I looked at the map, at the properties highlighted in red, the ones they couldn't acquire. Each one represented years of careful planning, of building relationships with local owners, of protecting our neighborhood's heart while preparing for exactly this moment. "Actually," I said, opening my desk drawer, "I do know who owns those properties." Richard's eyes lit up. "Finally, give us the contact information. We'll make it worth your while." "No need." I placed a thick folder on the desk. "All the property deeds, company registrations, and ownership documents are right here." The lawyers reached for the folder, but I held up a hand. "Before you open this, Richard, let me ask you something. Did you ever wonder why I never took Sarah's trust fund money? Why I kept running this failing restaurant instead of cashing in?" He frowned. "Because you're stubborn, because you can't see the bigger picture." "No," I said quietly, "because I saw a picture bigger than luxury hotels and upscale boutiques. I saw a neighborhood worth protecting." I opened the folder and handed him the first document. His face went from confusion to shock as he read. This is impossible, he stuttered. Summit Holdings LLC is registered to me, I finished. Just like Eastern Star Investments, River City Properties, and all the others. I've spent the last 5 years buying every strategic property in this neighborhood. Not to destroy it like you plan to, but to preserve what makes it special. The room erupted in chaos. Lawyers frantically flipped through documents, the project manager stared at his map in disbelief, and Richard looked like he might explode. You, he sputtered. You've been blocking our development? Do you have any idea how much money you've cost us? Less than you've cost this neighborhood over the years, I replied. How many family businesses have you forced out? How many communities have you destroyed with your luxury developments? Sarah appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. Dad, sit down before you have a stroke. You knew about this? He turned to her. Your husband has been sabotaging our biggest project, and you knew? Of course I knew, she said calmly. I helped him set up some of the companies. Did you really think I spent all those years in corporate law just to be a developer's daughter? Richard collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. Why? Why go to all this trouble? I stood and walked to the window, looking out at my neighborhood. At Mrs. Liu's grocery store, at the family-owned bakery across the street, at the community that had welcomed my grandfather 60 years ago. Because this neighborhood isn't just real estate, I said. It's people, stories, dreams. My grandfather built this restaurant when most banks wouldn't even lend to Chinese immigrants. Mrs. Liu's store helped countless new families get their start. The Garcia family's bakery puts 3 kids through college on their bread sales. I turned back to face them. So yes, I spent 5 years quietly buying properties. Not to get rich, but to make sure this neighborhood stays what it's always been. A place where immigrant families can build their American dream without fear of being pushed out by luxury condos. Adam Torres, the project manager, suddenly looked up from his papers. These properties, they're now worth at least 5 times what you paid for them. Probably more, given your development plans, I agreed. But they're not for sale. Not to you, not to any developer. Then what's your plan? Richard demanded. You can't just sit on all this property forever. Actually, I can, and I'll do better than that. I handed him another document. I'm creating the Golden Dragon Community Trust. All these properties will be transferred to the trust, with long-term leases guaranteed for local business owners. Rents will be kept affordable, and any profits will fund small business loans for new immigrant entrepreneurs. Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. I've already drawn up the legal framework. It's ironclad, Dad. This neighborhood will stay exactly what it is, a place where people can build their dreams without fear of being priced out. Richard stared at us for a long moment. For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of respect. You outmaneuvered me, he said finally. All these years, I thought you were just a stubborn chef who got lucky with my daughter. But you were playing a completely different game. Not a game, I corrected. A legacy, just not the kind you understand. The lawyers packed up their documents, the project manager rolled up his maps, and one by one, they filed out of my office. Richard was the last to leave. Daniel, he paused at the door. That Kung Pao chicken. Catherine really does love it. I smiled. Tell her it's on the house. Family discount. After they left, Sarah and I stood at the window, watching them walk to their expensive cars. Think they'll try to challenge the trust? She asked. They can try, I replied, but you're too good a lawyer for that. Besides, I think your father finally gets it. Some things are worth more than money. That evening, the restaurant was packed as usual. Mrs. Liu came by with fresh vegetables from her store. The Garcia kids helped clear tables between homework assignments. Ming's daughter practiced her college application essay in a back booth. I stood in my kitchen, feeling the familiar rhythm of woks and cleavers, listening to the mix of languages and laughter that filled the air. This was what I had protected, not just buildings and businesses, but a living, breathing community. Richard's development company announced their project's relocation the next week. The investors were upset, but they found another neighborhood to transform. This one, though, would stay as it was, a place where dreams could grow slowly, naturally, like steam rising from a well-used wok. Last month, a young couple came to see me. They wanted to open a Vietnamese pho restaurant in one of the trust's properties. As I listened to their plans, their hopes, I saw my grandfather in them. The same determination, the same dream of building something lasting. The rent is affordable, I told them. The lease is secure. All you need is good food and hard work. They signed the papers that afternoon. Another story beginning, another dream taking root in soil I'd helped protect. Sarah teases me sometimes about my long game, about how I spent 5 years quietly building a real estate empire just to keep things from changing. But she understands, better than anyone, that some changes are worth preventing. These days, when developers come sniffing around our neighborhood, they leave quickly. The local business owners just smile and direct them to the Golden Dragon Community Trust's legal office, where my brilliant wife explains, in perfect legal terms, why this particular American dream isn't for sale. And in my kitchen, I keep cooking, watching over my neighborhood like my grandfather once did, ensuring that future generations will have their chance to build something lasting in their own time, in their own way. After all, the best recipes can't be rushed. They need time, patience, and most importantly, a place to call home.